What would you argue for if your soul depended on it? What if the brightest minds of an age battled over ideas so fundamental they threatened to rewrite reality itself? Get ready to dive into the most explosive intellectual showdowns of the medieval era, from the 11th century to the 15th, where scholars fought with fierce dedication over questions that still echo today. Number 6. The problem of universals. What is real? Imagine an academic dispute that lasted for centuries, stirring up intense passion, shaping how people thought about everything from God to a single flower. This was the problem of universals, a debate so fundamental it touched every corner of medieval thought. At its heart was a seemingly simple question. When we talk about humanity, redness, or justice, what exactly are we talking about? Do these general concepts, called universals, exist as real things out there in the world, or are they just names we give to groups of individual things? The medieval university halls hummed with this question, scholars arguing furiously in Latin, their minds grappling with concepts that felt as solid as stone and as fleeting as a whisper. On one side stood the realists. They believed that universals were not just mental tricks or convenient labels. For the extreme realists, heavily influenced by the ancient Greek philosopher Plato, universals existed independently. For them, humanity was a real, perfect form existing somewhere outside of space and time, and every individual human being was just the imperfect copy or participation in that perfect form. A specific human being, like a grumpy monk or a cheerful peasant, might die, but the universal concept of humanity would endure forever, untouched and unchanging. This view, articulated by early medieval thinkers like Boethius, suggested a world where true reality lay beyond our senses, in these perfect, eternal forms. If you saw a red apple, a red cloak, and a red sunset, it wasn't just that they shared a similar color. They were all participating in the real existing universal of redness. This had massive implications for theology. If God was a universal, did that mean there was a separate reality for God that individual divine persons participated in? Or if humanity was truly real, how did original sin pass down through it? The stakes were high, and the air was often thick with intellectual tension. Then came the moderate realists, who found a middle path, largely inspired by another ancient Greek giant, Aristotle, and later championed by towering figures like Thomas Aquinas. For them, universals were real, but they didn't float around in some separate, ethereal realm. Instead, universals existed within the individual things themselves. So humanity wasn't some freestanding entity. It was present in every single human being, making them what they were. The concept of humanity could then be abstracted or drawn out by the human mind from observing many individual humans. It also existed in God's mind as a blueprint or exemplar before creation. This view allowed for universals to be real and provide a basis for knowledge, while still grounding them in the tangible world we experience. When a scholar looked at a tree, they saw an individual tree, but their mind could also grasp the universal treeness that made it a tree, distinguishing it from a rock or a river. This approach sought to bridge the gap between the concrete and the abstract, trying to make sense of how we categorize and understand the vast array of individual things in the world. But waiting in the wings and growing in strength were the nominalists. They launched a radical challenge to both forms of realism. For thinkers like Rosslyn in the 11th century, and later, and most famously William of Ockham in the 14th century, universals were simply names nomina, hence nominalism. There was no separate humanity out there, or even humanity existing within individuals as some shared essence. All that truly existed were individual things. When we use the word human, it's just a convenient label or concept in our minds that we apply to a collection of similar individuals. It's a mental shortcut, not a reflection of an external reality. For Occam, in particular, the focus was on simplicity, a principle often called Occam's razor. Do not multiply entities beyond necessity. If we can explain the world by only acknowledging individual things, why invent these complex, invisible universals? This was a revolutionary idea. If universals were just names, then what did that mean for shared moral principles, for the very idea of a universal church, or even for understanding the nature of God? Consequences of this debate were immense and truly deadly in their intellectual weight. If you were an extreme nominalist like Rosciel, your views could lead to accusations of heresy. Roscellin's understanding of the Trinity, for example, was seen as reducing the three divine persons to three separate gods, a form of tritheism. Because if God was just a name, how could the three persons share a single divine essence? He was condemned at the Council of Soissons in 1092 and forced to recant. This showed how philosophical debates could directly impact theological orthodoxy and put one's life or liberty at risk. The problem of universals wasn't just a philosophical puzzle. It was a foundational issue for every field of study. How could logic work if shared categories didn't exist? How could science classify and understand the natural world? How could theology speak of concepts like original sin or the nature of the divine? A realist would argue that knowledge was possible because universals existed and could be grasped, giving stability to concepts. A nominalist would argue that knowledge was based on our experience of individual things and that our concepts were tools for organizing that experience, leading to a more empirical approach to understanding the world. Clash between these views often played out dramatically in university settings, particularly in Paris and Oxford, intellectual powerhouses of the medieval world. Students would choose sides. Masters would defend their positions with passionate lectures and disputations, and careers could rise or fall based on the intellectual dexterity displayed in tackling this core problem. The debates were not quiet, polite academic discussions. They were often fiery, with scholars using every tool of logic and rhetoric to dismantle their opponents' arguments. The ripple effects of this debate continued long past the medieval period, influencing the rise of modern science, changing how people understood the relationship between language and reality, and shaping the very foundations of Western philosophy. It was a debate that truly shook the academic world to its core. Number 5. The eternity of the world. Was there a beginning? Imagine a concept so explosive it could threaten the very foundations of your faith. For medieval scholars, one such idea was the eternity of the world. This wasn't just a casual philosophical question. It was a direct clash between the bedrock of Christian doctrine and the powerful resurgence of ancient Greek thought, especially the teachings of Aristotle. For centuries, the question of whether the world had a beginning in time or had always existed sparked some of the most heated and dangerous intellectual battles. Christian theology, as taught in Scripture and by the Church Fathers, stated unequivocally that God created the world out of nothing, ex nihilo, at a specific point in time. This act of creation was a cornerstone of their understanding of God's omnipotence and His relationship with humanity. It signified God's absolute freedom and His role as the sole source of all being. To deny a temporal beginning was to chip away at this fundamental truth. But then came Aristotle. His philosophical works, rediscovered and translated into Latin in the 12th and 13th centuries, revolutionized medieval academia. Aristotle, in his influential writings, had argued for the eternity of the world. For him, motion was eternal, time was eternal, and since the world was the source and subject of this eternal motion, it too must be eternal. He based his arguments on logical deductions about cause and effect, the nature of time, and the impossibility of something coming from absolute nothingness. Aristotle's philosophy was incredibly compelling, offering a comprehensive and rational system for understanding the natural world. Scholars revered his intellect, calling him the philosopher. The arrival of Aristotle's complete works, along with commentaries by the Islamic philosopher Averroes, who strongly supported Aristotle's view on the world's eternity, created an immense intellectual dilemma. How could the brightest minds reconcile this revered philosophical truth with the absolute theological truth of creation in time? This wasn't a minor disagreement, it was a battle for the very soul of medieval thought. Some scholars, notably the Latin Averroists, like Sigurd of Brabant and Boethius of Dacia, were drawn to Aristotle's powerful philosophical arguments. They presented the philosophical case for the world's eternity with great clarity, acknowledging that reason seemed to lead to this conclusion. They faced a difficult tightrope walk. They would often state that philosophy led to the conclusion of the world's eternity, while affirming by faith that the world was created in time. This nuanced position often led to accusations of holding a double truth, a concept we will discuss further, where something could be philosophically true, but theologically false. Regardless of their intentions, simply presenting the arguments for eternity was dangerous. On the other side, staunch defenders of Christian doctrine worked tirelessly to counter these arguments. Bonaventure, a prominent Franciscan theologian, was one of the most vocal opponents of the world's eternity. He argued vigorously that it was not only a theological error, but also philosophically unsound. He tried to demonstrate, through reason, that an eternal world would lead to logical absurdities, such as the completion of an infinite series. He argued that the concept of an infinite number of souls existing at once, for example, was impossible. For Bonaventure, philosophy itself could and should support the truth of creation in time. Thomas Aquinas, perhaps the most influential theologian of the era, took a different yet equally determined approach. He recognized the power of Aristotle's logic and the difficulty of philosophically proving that the world had a beginning. He admitted that arguments used to try and disprove the world's eternity were not definitively conclusive. For Aquinas, the world's beginning in time was a truth known only through revelation and accepted by faith, not something that could be demonstrated by pure philosophical reason alone. However, he firmly rejected the idea that the world could not have a beginning, arguing that God's omnipotence meant he could create something from nothing, even if our limited reason found it difficult to grasp. He maintained that there was no inherent contradiction between reason and faith, and that if something appeared philosophically true but contradicted faith, then the philosophical argument must contain a flaw, even if not immediately obvious. To publicly assert that the world was eternal was to challenge a core tenet of Christian belief. It was perceived as a direct attack on the omnipotence of God and the veracity of Scripture. The intellectual authorities, particularly the Bishop of Paris, Stephen Tempier, viewed these ideas with profound alarm. In 1270, and even more significantly in 1277, Tempier issued sweeping condemnations of numerous propositions being taught at the University of Paris, many of which were directly linked to the eternity of the world and other Aristotelian or Averroist ideas. These condemnations were a severe blow to philosophical freedom. Teaching any of the condemned propositions could lead to excommunication, the loss of one's academic position, and potentially even greater persecution. Scholars were forced to be extremely careful in how they presented or even discussed these ideas. The threat of heresy hung heavy over any deviation from orthodox doctrine. Historians like Edward Grant have detailed how these condemnations forced scholars to reevaluate the relationship between philosophy and theology, influencing the very direction of future scientific and philosophical inquiry. The debate over the eternity of the world was a defining struggle of the medieval mind, a perilous tightrope walk between the demands of reason and the dictates of faith, with serious consequences for those who dared to err. Number 4. The nature of God's power. How free is God? Imagine a theological wrestling match over the very nature of God, a debate that would radically reshape how medieval scholars understood divine power, morality, and even the laws of nature. This wasn't about whether God existed, but how God existed and operated in the universe. At its core was a deeply unsettling question. Is God's will bound by logic and inherent reason, or is God's will absolutely free beyond any logical constraint? This debate primarily fought in the late 13th and 14th centuries, particularly at the universities of Oxford and Paris, opened up a chasm in philosophical and theological thought. On one side stood the intellectualists, often associated with the thought of Thomas Aquinas. For them, God's will was perfectly ordered and guided by his perfect intellect. God, being supremely rational and good, could only will what was good and logically possible. God's omnipotence meant he could do anything logically possible. But logic itself was inherent in God's perfect being. God could not, for example, make a square circle, because that is a logical impossibility. Nor could God command evil, because evil is a privation of good, and God is goodness itself. In this view, God's reason is primary. His will follows his perfect understanding. The world, therefore, reflected God's rational order, and human reason could to a degree grasp the inherent rationality of God's creation and his moral law. This perspective offered a stable, knowable universe where divine reason provided the framework for all existence and morality. But a powerful counter-movement arose, championed by thinkers like Duns Scotus, a brilliant Franciscan, and later pushed to radical extremes by William of Ockham. These were the voluntarists. They argued that God's will was absolutely supreme and primary. For them, it was God's will that determined what was rational, good, and even what was possible. God's freedom was boundless. Scotus, for example, emphasized God's potentia absoluta, absolute power, and potentia ordinata, ordained or ordered power. God, by his absolute power, could have created a completely different world, established different moral laws, or even allowed humanity a different path to salvation. The moral laws we observe are good because God willed them to be good, not because they are inherently good, independent of God's will. God's ordained power refers to the way he chose to act in creation and revelation, establishing the order we know. Occam took this voluntarism to its logical, and for some terrifying conclusion. He argued that God's power was so absolute that God could have made hating God meritorious, or made stealing virtuous if he had willed it. He quickly clarified that God would never do such a thing, as his nature is good, but the possibility demonstrated the unconstrained nature of divine will. This radical emphasis on God's sheer freedom meant that human reason's ability to deduce moral truths or the nature of the universe from inherent principles was significantly reduced. Instead, one had to rely more heavily on what God had revealed or willed through scripture and observation. The background to this intensifying debate was complex. Condemnations of 1277 by Bishop Stephen Tempier, while primarily aimed at Aristotelian rationalism and Latin Averroism, ironically played a role. By condemning propositions that seemed to limit God's power or imply that creation was constrained by necessity, these condemnations inadvertently opened the door for a greater emphasis on God's absolute freedom. Scholars began to explore the implications of a God whose will was truly unconstrained by any pre-existing essences or ideas. The stakes in this debate were enormous. If God's will was primary and his reason secondary, or merely descriptive of his will, then what did that mean for the predictability and knowability of the universe? It shifted the focus from seeking inherent rational principles to observing what God had actually willed into existence. This had implications for the development of natural philosophy and later, science. If the world operates according to laws that are ultimately products of God's arbitrary, though benevolent, will, then the best way to understand those laws is through empirical observation and experimentation, rather than purely rational deduction from universal principles. For theology, it changed the understanding of salvation, grace, and morality. If God's will was paramount, then the emphasis shifted from human merit earned through adherence to natural law towards God's free grace and predestination. It raised questions about whether God could make his own laws contradictory or change them on a whim. While proponents stressed God's steadfastness and goodness, critics worried about the potential for divine arbitrariness and the undermining of natural law, which many believe was discernible by reason. The debate over God's power created a deep fault line in medieval thought, influencing thinkers for centuries to come and shaping how later generations would approach questions of divine authority, human reason, and the very structure of the cosmos. Number 3. The double truth theory. Can truth contradict itself? Imagine a university classroom where the most brilliant minds of the era grappled with a truly perplexing question. Could something be true in philosophy and yet false in theology, or vice versa? This was the core of the double truth theory, a notion that sparked outrage and fear among medieval authorities. It wasn't about a simple disagreement, but about the very nature of truth itself and the supremacy of religious doctrine. This intense intellectual battle unfolded primarily in the 13th century at the bustling University of Paris, a vibrant hub of philosophical and theological innovation. The concept of a double truth arose largely from the monumental influx of ancient Greek philosophical works, particularly those of Aristotle, along with the detailed commentaries by the Islamic philosopher Averroes. Aristotle offered a powerful, comprehensive system for understanding the natural world through reason and observation. Averroes, in his interpretations, pushed many of Aristotle's ideas to their logical conclusions, even when they seemed to clash with religious dogma. For example, Aristotle and Averroes both argued for the eternity of the world and the unity of the human intellect, meaning all humans share one single intellect, not individual ones, conclusions that directly contradicted Christian teachings on creation and individual immortality. Some scholars, often referred to as Latin Averroists, like Siger of Brabant and Boethius of Dacia, found themselves in a difficult position. They were rigorous philosophers, committed to following reason wherever it led. Their philosophical investigations, using Aristotelian methods, seemed to lead them to conclusions that were at odds with revealed theological truths. Rather than outright deny Christian dogma, they sometimes adopted a stance where they would present the philosophical argument as logically compelling and true from the perspective of reason, while simultaneously affirming the theological truth by faith. They might say, "By reason the world is eternal, but by faith it was created in time." Or, philosophically, there is one intellect for all humans, but theologically, each person has an individual soul. It is important to note that whether these Averroists truly believed in two contradictory truths existing simultaneously, or if they were merely presenting philosophical conclusions as philosophy while accepting that revealed truth ultimately trumped them, remains a matter of historical debate. Some scholars argue they were simply exploring philosophical possibilities without necessarily affirming them as their personal beliefs. However, the perception by church authorities was that they were indeed teaching propositions that implied a contradictory double truth, which was deemed incredibly dangerous. Church and prominent theologians like Thomas Aquinas and Bonaventure vehemently rejected any notion of a double truth. For them, truth was singular and unified. God, the author of both revelation, faith, and creation, the source of reason, could not contradict himself. Therefore, true philosophical conclusions and true theological doctrines could never be in conflict. If an apparent contradiction arose, it meant either the philosophical argument was flawed or the theological interpretation was mistaken. For Aquinas, philosophy served as a handmaiden to theology. It could illuminate and clarify theological truths, but it could not stand in opposition to them. He worked tirelessly to integrate Aristotelian philosophy into Christian theology, showing how reason and faith, properly understood, were ultimately harmonious. The stakes in this debate were nothing short of existential for medieval academia. If philosophical reason could lead to truths that contradicted revelation, then the very intellectual authority of the Church was undermined. It created a dangerous precedent where reason could be seen as an independent, potentially subversive source of truth. It threatened to fracture the seamless worldview where all knowledge ultimately flowed from God and cohered under the umbrella of theology. Climax of this intellectual struggle came in 1277, when Bishop Stephen Tempier of Paris issued a sweeping condemnation of 219 philosophical and theological propositions being taught at the university. Many of these propositions were directly linked to Averroist ideas, including the eternity of the world, the unity of the intellect, and indeed the idea that something could be true philosophically but false theologically. The condemnations explicitly forbade the teaching of these propositions under pain of excommunication. Students and masters were required to swear oaths to uphold the Church's doctrines. The severity of these condemnations reflected the deep fear that the double truth theory, or even the perception of it, posed a direct challenge to the supremacy of faith and the unified nature of truth. Siger of Brabant, a leading Averroist, was summoned to the papal court and eventually died in circumstances that are debated, but some accounts suggest he was murdered. This demonstrates the deadly nature of these intellectual battles, where ideas could have profound and dangerous real-world consequences for their proponents. The rejection of double truth reinforced the principle that ultimately revealed theological truth held ultimate authority in the medieval intellectual landscape, shaping the boundaries of permissible philosophical inquiry for centuries to come. Number 2. The Immaculate Conception. Was Mary without sin? Imagine a theological dispute so intense it caused fierce rivalry between powerful religious orders, leading to public brawls and heated condemnations. This was the centuries-long debate over the Immaculate Conception, the question of whether the Virgin Mary was conceived without original sin. It sounds like a nuanced theological point, but for medieval scholars, it was a battleground for understanding salvation, Christ's redemption, and the very nature of human sin. At the heart of the debate was a profound question. If Christ's redemption was universal and necessary for all humanity, how could Mary be an exception? The traditional understanding was that all humans, save Christ, were conceived in original sin, a spiritual inheritance from Adam and Eve. Christ's sacrifice on the cross was necessary to cleanse humanity from this stain. On one side of this passionate argument stood many Dominicans, following the lead of the towering theologian Thomas Aquinas. They argued that Mary, like all humans, must have been conceived in original sin. To claim otherwise, they contended, would diminish the universality of Christ's redemption. If Mary was born without original sin, then she didn't need Christ as her Redeemer, which contradicted the fundamental belief that Christ saved all humanity. They believed that Mary was indeed redeemed, but that her redemption was prevenient. This meant Christ's grace applied to her at the moment of her conception, preserving her from original sin in anticipation of his future sacrifice, rather than cleansing her from it after she had contracted it. But for Aquinas, her purification from sin was still an effect of Christ's saving power, which still implied she was subject to sin before purification. It was a subtle but crucial distinction. Opposing them with equal fervor were the Franciscans, who became the most ardent defenders of the Immaculate Conception. Their champion was Duns Scotus, a brilliant Franciscan philosopher known for his intricate and precise logic. Scotus argued that Christ's redemption was so perfect and powerful that it could be applied in two ways, either by cleansing someone from sin they had already contracted, or by preventing sin from ever touching someone in the first place. Contended that it was a more perfect and glorious act of redemption for Christ to preserve Mary from sin entirely from the very first instant of her conception, than to merely cleanse her from it after she had fallen. Mary, as the Mother of God, should be utterly pure and untainted by sin from the very beginning. Scotus summarized his argument with the famous phrase, "Potuit, dicuit, ergo fecit." God could do it. It was fitting for him to do it. Therefore, he did it. This emphasized God's omnipotence and the fittingness of such a profound purity for the one chosen to bear God incarnate. The debate raged for centuries, particularly from the 13th to the 15th centuries, often spilling out of academic disputations and into public life. The Dominican and Franciscan orders, already strong rivals, turned this theological point into a matter of institutional pride and identity. Universities, especially Paris, became intellectual battlegrounds where masters and students took sides. There were public debates, sermons condemning the opposing view, and even on occasion physical altercations between the passionate adherents of each side. The stakes were significant. For the Dominicans, denying the Immaculate Conception was seen as upholding the universal necessity of Christ's redemption and avoiding any theological position that might seem to diminish his role. For the Franciscans, asserting the Immaculate Conception was seen as a way to glorify Mary, and by extension God's boundless power and the perfect efficacy of Christ's grace. Accusations of theological error were common, and scholars who firmly held one view might face opposition or condemnation from those holding the other. While the debate was fierce, no definitive church dogma on the Immaculate Conception was issued during the medieval period. This indicates just how deeply divided and unresolved the issue was among the most brilliant minds of the time. It highlights that, even on matters closely related to core beliefs, medieval academia could sustain long, passionate disagreements without immediate official pronouncements. The eventual declaration of the Immaculate Conception as dogma came much later, in 1854, a testament to the enduring power of the medieval arguments in the long journey of theological consensus. The debate over Mary's conception was a stark reminder that even within the confines of established faith, there was vast room for intense intellectual struggle and profound disagreement. Number 1. The nature of Christ's poverty. How much did he own? Imagine a debate over something seemingly simple like personal belongings that escalated into accusations of heresy, excommunication, and even the threat of burning at the stake. This was the fierce, often brutal conflict over the nature of Christ's poverty, a struggle that fundamentally challenged the wealth and authority of the medieval church itself. This wasn't just an academic discussion. It became a defining struggle for the very identity of the Franciscan order and a direct confrontation with the papacy in the early 14th century. The heart of the debate was a profound theological and philosophical question. Did Christ and his apostles own any property, either individually or in common? And what did their example of poverty mean for the Church and its members? For the early Franciscans, following the radical teachings of St. Francis of Assisi, absolute poverty was the cornerstone of their spiritual life. They strove to imitate Christ's humble existence, believing that true holiness lay in renouncing all possessions, embracing a life of mendicancy, relying on charity for their daily needs. This ideal, however, became a source of deep division within the Franciscan order itself, splitting into the conventuals, who favored a more communal and less strict interpretation of poverty, and the spirituals, who insisted on the absolute uncompromising poverty of Christ as the only true path. The spirituals argued that Christ and his apostles not only owned nothing, but they also held no right to use anything, merely the simple use of fact, usus facti, of things necessary for survival, without any legal dominion or ownership. They possessed nothing, not even legally. This meant they used food as they ate it, clothes as they wore them, without having any legal claim over them. For the spirituals, this absolute poverty was the perfect model for the entire church, a stark contrast to the vast wealth and land holdings accumulated by the papacy and other ecclesiastical institutions. Their fervent belief posed a direct challenge to the authority and legitimacy of the powerful, wealthy, medieval church. If Christ and the apostles held no property, then how could the Pope claim temporal dominion? Or how could the church accumulate vast estates and treasures? This was a dangerous question. Enter Pope John the 22nd. Reigning from Avignon, he was a pragmatic and powerful pontiff who needed the church's wealth to fund its administration and political endeavors. He viewed the spiritual Franciscans' extreme views on poverty as not just a theological nuisance, but a direct attack on papal authority and the church's right to possess property. He feared that their radical interpretation undermined the very legal basis of the church's vast holdings. John the 22nd took a strong and decisive stance. In a series of papal bulls, particularly Ad Conditorem Canonum 1322 and Cumen Internannuos 1323, he condemned the spiritual Franciscans' position. Quote, he declared that it was heretical to assert that Christ and his apostles held no possessions either individually or in common. He argued that it was impossible to have the use of a thing without having some form of right over it, even if that right was merely to consume or dispose of it. For the Pope, asserting absolute poverty to the point of denying any right of use contradicted basic human experience and legal principles. He saw it as a dangerous and ultimately false interpretation of Scripture and tradition. The stakes for those on the wrong side of this debate were truly deadly. The spiritual Franciscans who refused to recant their beliefs were persecuted. Many were imprisoned, and some were even burned at the stake as heretics. This was a clear example of a theological debate escalating into violent repression. William of Ockham, the brilliant nominalist philosopher, became deeply embroiled in this controversy. As a Franciscan, he initially supported the order's ideal of poverty and later sided with Michael of Cesena, the Franciscan minister general, against Pope John the 22nd. Ockham argued that the Pope's declaration was itself heretical. He developed complex legal and philosophical arguments distinguishing between simple use and legal ownership, defending the Franciscan ideal of absolute poverty. His writings during this period, such as the Opus Nonagita Dierum, meticulously laid out his arguments against the Pope, showing deep scholarship and intellectual daring. His defiance led to his excommunication and his flight from Avignon, along with Michael of Cesena, seeking refuge with the Holy Roman Emperor Louis IV, who was also in conflict with the Pope. Ockham spent years under the emperor's protection, continuing to write extensive polemical works against the papacy. The debate over Christ's poverty was more than just an academic squabble. It was a profound struggle over the very identity of the Church, its relationship to worldly power, and the limits of papal authority. It highlighted the tension between a radical ascetic ideal and the practical realities of a powerful institutional church. The fierce repression and persecution associated with this debate underscore how fundamental and dangerous these intellectual battles could be for medieval scholars and religious figures, proving that arguments over abstract ideas could have very real, very grim consequences.